Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the activities that Ayn Rand is engaged in her short work, The Virtue of Selfishness, and indeed in her larger body of work, is engaging and criticizing and ultimately rejecting and providing reasons for rejecting other rival moral theories or perspectives. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about any other approach in ethics that she considers to be wrong-headed or misguided. And in doing so, this is not a particularly innovative or unusual thing in the field of ethics. You see, every major moral theory and every major moral theorist doing the same. So utilitarians need to be able to say, for example, why it is that other things either amount to utilitarianism, just not done quite so well, or are opposed to utilitarianism and are thereby wrong for this and this and this reason. And Rand is doing something quite similar in terms of her objectivist or rational egoist ethics. So in chapter 1 of The Virtue of Selfishness, the Objectivist Ethics, she talks in terms of three main, let's call them families of theories. She actually calls them each of them a theory, but we should understand them as more like a bundle or a bucket that theories fall into if they have certain characteristics. And she sketches out a certain sort of very broad history of the development of moral ideas. This is very early on. And she also makes some rather startling claims. She says that no philosopher has given a rational, objectively demonstrable scientific answer to the question of why man needs a code of values. So long as that question remained unanswered, no rational, scientific, objective code of ethics could be discovered or defined. And then she brings up Aristotle, who she's a big fan of. The greatest of all philosophers, Aristotle, did not regard ethics as an exact science. So she's claiming that what she's doing is for the very first time a truly scientific, objective type of ethics. Now, again, that's not a radically new claim. We see people like Thomas Hobbes making that in Leviathan, and we can set that aside for the moment. But if you accept that point of view, which we're going to do for the time being, then the story that she's telling makes quite a bit of sense. So she says that most philosophers took the existence of ethics for granted as the given as a historical fact. They were not concerned with discovering its metaphysical cause or objective validation. Many of them attempted to break the traditional monopoly of what she's calling mysticism in the field of ethics and allegedly to define a rational, scientific, non-religious morality. So that's actually going to be stage 2. So what is stage 1? It's what she's calling the mystic approach or theory or perspective in ethics. So let's take a look at what she actually says about that. The mystics, and here she's not using the term in a very precise sense to mean, what we can label as mysticism in, say, Neoplatonic philosophy or, when we're talking in a religious studies sense. She's using it in a very broad, essentially pejorative way of talking about anybody who's non-rational and appealing to something supernatural or God or anything along those lines. So she says, they held the arbitrary, unaccountable will of God as the standard of the good and the validation of their ethics. So any sort of ethics that has a religious basis, whether that be that of traditional Christianity or Islam or Mahayana Buddhism. I mean, if you look at people who like to say Buddhism is non-theistic, that's not entirely true. And we could talk about other spiritual leaders as sort of straddling the line. Think about Confucianism. Any of those sort of things Rand would probably place in the bucket of mystical. And she says that a little bit later on. This is towards the end of the chapter. She says, the mystic theory of ethics is explicitly based on the premise that the standard of value of man's ethics is set beyond the grave. So there's some sort of heavenly reward, whether it be a better reincarnation or paradise or avoiding hell or who knows what it's going to be. She says that it's set by the laws or requirements of another supernatural dimension. And she goes on a little bit further, and I think she's actually getting at something that we see some religious perspectives putting forth, so she's not entirely distorting the essence of religion in talking about this, but it certainly doesn't apply to everyone. She says, it means that ethics is impossible for human beings to practice. It's unsuited for it and imposed to man's life on earth, that man must take the blame for it and suffer through the whole of his earthly existence to atone for the guilt of being unable to practice the impractical. So it's saying essentially there's this whatever it is, this transcendent ideal that's being set up, purportedly the will of the divine, and human beings can't measure up to it, but they're nevertheless supposed to measure up to it, so they feel guilty, and that's what's driving them. And it's thoroughly irrational, and she says this is what we can associate with the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. They are the existential monument to this theory of ethics, meaning that we can look at those time periods and their cultures and their moral discourses and say, aha, there's the mystical theory of ethics. So, put that aside for the moment, and we come to what she calls the social theory of ethics. And she says that this is derived from philosophers who are trying to get past any sort of religious, transcendent, supernatural grounding of ethics, and they're trying to provide something in its place. And she calls them neo-mystics because they replace God with the good of society. And she says, collapsing into the circularity of a definition such as the standard of the good is that which is good for society. And then she says, this means that society stands above any principle of ethics because it's the source, standard, and criterion of ethics. The good is whatever society wills. And this means that the individual has to be subordinated and, if need be, sacrificed to the demands of society, which is really the demands either of an elite who's deciding what to do with the social levers, or a sort of vague conception or a concrete experience of other people. So the social theory of ethics is saying that the human being ought to be sacrificed, if need be, for the good of others. And again, she discusses this at the end of the chapter. Here we go, saying that although it claims its chief concern is life on earth, it's not the life of man, not the life of an individual, but the life of a disembodied entity, the collective, which in relation to every individual consists of everybody except himself. As far as the individual is concerned, his ethical duty is to be the selfless, voiceless, rightless slave of any need, claim, or demand asserted by others. So, this view is that one doesn't really have any intrinsic value or rights except in relation to the other or the vast assembly of others, a big O other that is society. Then she says, philosophers got to the point where they declared that reason has failed. Ethics is outside the power of reason. No rational ethics can ever be defined. And in the field of ethics, in the choice of values, of actions, pursuits, life goals, man must be guided by something other than reason. And this is, easy to identify with what happened in at least Anglo-American philosophy in the early 20th century with the theory of emotivism, right, which took great hold. And I suppose you could say, you could sprinkle in there a bit of cultural relativism as well, and a sort of general suspicion about ethics that turned into this burgeoning discipline of meta-ethics, where people were less concerned about, working out a substantive, systematic ethics and more about, the nature of ethical language or things like that, engaging in high-order reflection. And the result of that is that a certain kind of erosion takes place. And she calls this the subjective theory of ethics because everything does become essentially subjective. What can we use other than reason? She gives you a number of different candidates here. Faith, instinct, intuition, revelation, feeling, taste, urge, wish. And then she italicizes this afterwards, whim. I mean, what could be more subjective than whim? She says, today, most philosophers agree that the ultimate standard of ethics is whim. They call it by other names, arbitrary postulate or subjective choice or emotional commitment. And then she says, and she's recognizing something quite important here. She says, if that's the case, then it's not quite so innocent as we'd like to pretend. The question is, whose whim will dominate? Who gets to call the shots? As she says, the battle is over the question of whose whim, one's own or one's society or the dictator or God. Whatever else they may disagree about, today's moralists agree that ethics is a subjective issue, right? So she sees that as a real problem. And she's going to say that, strictly speaking, it's not a theory, but a negation of ethics. And she goes on to say it's a negation of reality, a negation not only of man's existence, but all existence. And that's, quite a claim being made there. She's also going to talk about hedonistic ethics, meaning the pursuit of one's own pleasure, but she's understanding this as being in a ultimately non-rational way. It leads to what she calls moral cannibalism. She talks about the moral cannibalism of all hedonist and altruist doctrines. And she says that it lies in the premise that the happiness of one person necessitates the injury of another, the sacrifice either of one's own pleasures or of another person's. And she talks about this at a number of different stages. There is a kind of selfishness that is irrational and misguided from the perspective of Rand. At one point, she actually talks about Nietzsche as an example of this in his moral code, saying that you should try to just dominate other people. And she proposes something else instead, the moral ideal of the traitor who neither gives nor accepts what is not, earned, right? She also is going to talk about, and this comes up in the discussion of lifeboat ethics in chapter 3, the ethics of emergency. She talks about the false dichotomy of altruism. And we haven't been using this word altruism all that much, but the mystic theory of emotions, the social of ethics, the social theory of ethics, and even to some degree the subjective theory of ethics, provided it doesn't lapse into mere selfishness of a misguided sort, they're all forms of altruism. So what is altruism? It's being other-centered, making the other more valuable than oneself, making their needs, their wishes, their desires the priority, and denying oneself in the process. So she says that altruism frames things incorrectly. She says, altruism destroys the concept of any authentic benevolence or goodwill among people. It indoctrinates people with the idea that to value another human being is an act of selflessness, thus implying that you can have no personal interest in others, that to value another means to sacrifice oneself, and that any love, respect, or admiration a person may feel for others is not and cannot be a source of their own enjoyment, but is a threat to their existence. Here's the final word, a sacrificial blank check signed over to his loved ones. And she says, look, if you accept this dichotomy, you've got two choices. One side is to sacrifice yourself to others. The other is to say, well, I'm not going to sacrifice myself to others. I'm going to make others sacrifice themselves to me. And she does point out most men do not accept or practice either side of altruism's viciously false dichotomy, but the result winds up being an intellectual chaos on the issue of proper human relationships and the help that one can give to others. So altruism, just by being out there, induces this false dichotomy, which then makes it more difficult for us to think things through in a properly ethical way. So each of these is a moral theory or a sort of comportment or perspective within ethics that leads us astray from Rand's objectivist or rational egoist perspective, which she is preferring as the only genuine ethics available to us.